Welcome, welcome everyone. If you are here to learn how to build your community-centered voter guide, you're in the right place. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Meanwhile, enjoy the music, get comfortable. If you want to rename yourself with the newsroom, your fans, feel free. We'll get started in just a few minutes. All right, people are rolling in. We got about 17 folks. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. I'm Jen from Harkin and Election SOS, and I'm really excited to bring you this fabulous panel today about building community-centered voter guide. We'll get started. Here, let a few more folks come. We had a bunch of registrations. We will be sharing the recording of this with folks who registered for the music and also on the Election SOS website as well. That will include the guide, so you'll get the introduction. Also, if you want to say in the chat where you're coming in from, we're always curious which newsrooms are showing up today. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Well, great, South Dakota News Watch. Hey, Carson. Excellent. Oh, AI assistants are welcome. We'll probably have rights soon. Hi, Melissa from KXLY in Spokane. Great, ABC 10 in Sacramento. Wonderful. All right, well, I'm gonna fade down the Pointer Sisters here. Can't get enough of the song this time of year. And I'm going to get started by just sharing with everyone some amazing election and democracy related free resources for all of you before we get started. Because Election SOS and what we're doing is in a family of efforts from journalism support orgs that I want to make sure you know about, just in case you have to jump early, you have a sense for what is out there for you. We'll also email you the links to all of this stuff in the follow-up email from the webinar. So, oops, here we go. Where did we went to the end here? Now we're going back to the beginning. All right, so we know covering US elections is hard, and that's why we're here to help. So Election SOS, the Night Election Hub, the Democracy Toolkit, and Democracy Day, we're all here to support journalists around the United States covering elections and politics and government in what you're doing. And so the webinar that you are here today for is part of Election SOS, and we provide a weekly newsletter with upcoming training, funding opportunities, best practices, webinars. So please sign up for that if you haven't already. Again, we'll throw a link into the follow-up. We also have guides, checklists, and articles. We have a vetted expert network that includes lots of folks from around the country with various expertise and also in various languages. And then we also have this great compiled calendar that has all the industry trainings that we've heard about that could be useful for journalists that you can subscribe to. And we're going to be doing some scenario and tabletop planning exercises in the coming weeks as well. Also, the Night Election Hub, an incredible new resource that was just stood up like weeks ago that offers free or reduced price resources to US newsrooms covering the elections. So you can get access to thousands of dollars worth of tools for free, because Night is paying for you to get access to them, to get stuff like campaign data and polling and software, training, access to all sorts of things. So check out the Night Election Hub if you have not already. Ariel is working on behalf of them as well, so she could answer questions later if you have those about the Election Hub. We also have the Democracy Toolkit, and this was created in partnership between Harkin and the Center for Journalism and Democracy at Howard. And if you are new to covering democracy or this beat or elections, this is a great backgrounder that gives you all sorts of good information about what causes democratic backsliding and what journalists can do. So we have tons of guides and best practices and vetted resources. And then Democracy Day 2024. If you have not signed up, if your newsroom hasn't signed up to partner with Democracy Day 2024, it is a day of activation, September 15th, the International Day of Democracy, where newsrooms report on the threats to democracy and what people are doing to try to strengthen democracy. It's free to join. There's all sorts of amazing resources there as well. And then if you're someone who's a self-starter and likes to take online courses, there's a massive open online course that has lots of different ways to better cover elections, from engagement reporting to trust and transparency to solutions journalism. And that's a free course that you can take as well. And all of these things have been created by a collaborative network of journalism support orgs that you see here, and made possible also with funding from Democracy Fund and the Nate Foundation. So before we get started, I just wanted to preview the next webinar we're going to do, which if you sign up to our newsletter or go to Election SOS, you can sign up. We're going to talk about democracy framing your elections coverage. So rather than doing a partisan frame, taking a larger, kind of higher altitude look at what is happening so that people adequately understand the threats and don't just see it as red versus blue or this versus that. So that's going to be coming up next in just about 2 weeks. And then now we are here and ready to start building your community-centered voter guide. We have Lisa Snowden, Brianna Lee, and Ariel Zirulnick here, amazing people who have built these voter guides in their communities to share best practices. I'm going to throw it to my colleague Masara Makati to do a little intro to them and tell you how this next 50 or so minutes is going to go. So over to you, Masara.
Hey guys, thanks so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you. As you know, at Election SOS, what we are trying to do is support journalists and producing community-centered election coverage. And there's no better way, or one of the best ways to do that is with voter guides. We're really excited to have this team of amazing folks that have created really innovative voter guides over the past few years. We're going to be starting off with Ariel Zirulnick and Brianna Lee, who have created those voter guides for LAist. LAist has really led the charge in kind of changing the way that our industry looks at voter guides and how we should be centering communities and audiences with those voter guides. And then we're going to hop over to Lisa Snowden, who's the editor-in-chief of the Baltimore Beat. The Baltimore Beat recently did a really, really cool youth voter guide. I was really excited about that because those are our voters, you guys. Those are the people that are bringing the future, and the way that Baltimore Beat decided to focus in on them and empowering them to make election decisions was great. Also very exciting for them is that they just got funding from the American Press Institute to further build out that voter guide. So really excited. We're going to have some time at the end for a Q&A, but if you have any questions throughout their presentations, please feel free to throw them in the Q&A chat, and we'll try to get them during the presentation, or we'll save them for the last 15 minutes or so where you can ask those questions too. And otherwise, I think we'll get started. So I'll throw it over to you guys, Ariel and Brianna.
Thank you. And thank you for that very kind introduction about our voter guides. Love to hear it. Is everybody seeing my screen all right? Cool. So thanks everybody for being here. I'm Ariel Zirulnick. Until recently, I was the director of news experimentation at LAist, and I worked super closely for the last couple of years with my colleague Brianna Lee on our voter guides and sort of the wraparound products and services that we offered at LAist to help guide Angelenos through our very complicated elections and our very long ballots. So we're going to have Bree start by talking a little bit about how our overall election strategy changed and a little bit how it looked across our cross-platform newsroom. We publish at LAist.com, on the radio at LAist 89.3, and on podcasts at LAist Studios. I'll kick it to Bree.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Brianna Lee, Civics and Democracy producer for LAist. I started at LAist about 8 years ago, actually on the day of the primary election in 2016. And I've worked on every election since then in at least some capacity. So I've seen our election approach change pretty drastically over the years. And this is basically the TLDR of how it's changed. So we essentially went from reporting about campaigns to really shifting our focus to helping voters make their decisions. And so I'm going to illustrate sort of like how and why that happened. So it helps to kind of talk first about what we used to think about elections. You can go to the next slide. How we used to think about the elections and our general approach. And some of these might look familiar because it's a very traditional way of thinking about elections, and many newsrooms sort of thought about it then, and many still do right now. So one thing that we used to do was, really spending a lot of time talking about voters, not to voters, really explaining things like the dynamics of, the political environment or the stakes or the district, but not really helping voters figure out the choice in front of them. And we would focus on priority races, which is to say powerful races like executive seats, like mayor, governor, district attorney, sheriff, either ones that had a lot of power or ones that were very competitive. So things that had the ability to change larger political dynamics. So if there's a very hot congressional seat or a city council seat that could change the balance of power, we would focus on those and sort of deprioritize everything else. And then we would go hard on primary elections. Oh, ballot measures also, as well. So ballot measures with the same logic. If they were competitive or consequential, we would prioritize those. We went light on primaries and midterm years, and subsequently went harder on general elections and presidential years. Essentially, we were following the logic of turnout, the thinking being if people turn out for a specific kind of election or a specific kind of race, they must be inherently more interested in those races, and so we would cover them more. And so at the same time, we had a lot of different ways to collect questions from our audience. I was our social editor for 4 years. We had Harkin boxes at the bottom of many of our stories, almost all of our stories. And then, so we were collecting questions all across the board, and they were really showcasing that people had questions about things that were different from the approach that we were taking. Things like, how do I find information about judges, or this candidate on my ballot that I've never heard of? Where do they stand on the issues I care about? What about this local race or this ballot measure that nobody has said anything about? What can you tell me about that? And again, how do I vote on judges? People are really, really interested in judges over here. So over the years, we started tinkering around. We started putting out stories that address some of these questions, like a guide on how to think about judicial elections from a past president of the California Judges Association giving tips. We covered primary elections in more depth than we ordinarily would have, covering more candidates and treating it like we would have in a general election. And we started covering races that absolutely nobody was talking about, like the lieutenant governor's race in California, which like 0 people were having conversations about, but was causing a lot of confusion, not least because there were 2 Democrats running against each other, and people just didn't know how to think about how to make that choice. Every time we published one of these stories as like a little experiment, our traffic would spike for those stories. And so we knew that we were on to something. And eventually it started informing a larger overhaul in our strategy, which we finally got to do in 2022. A couple of things happened that gave us the opportunity to kind of just like revamp our entire strategy. One being that my position was created as civics and democracy producer, and the other one was that we really made a commitment to shift from talking about politicians to talking about voters and focusing on what voters needed. And so, so this is what our strategy sort of is oriented around now. Now we produce voter guides for as many races as we possibly can. It doesn't matter if people deem it important or, whatever. It's at a minimum, it means every single race that will appear on the larger LA County ballot and the LA City ballot, including those very obscure down ballot ones nobody's talking about. And we do guides on local ballot measures, even the ones that seem like they're just formalities, and a lot of them are. They might seem administrative and nobody's really fighting over them. And if we see commonly asked questions, we will add that to our coverage as well, because that helps sort of inform the direction of what we're talking about and what people are wondering about. And so we try to fill in those gaps and produce stories around commonly asked questions all the time. And so what does that look like in our guides? So this is a little clip from our guide to the LA County Assessor's Race, which was actually a pretty top performing guide. We always have a section that explains what is this office and what are real world examples of how they wield their power, really concrete ways of letting people understand what is the job that you are trying to hire for when you're looking at candidates, right? And then we also, we feature commonly asked questions. So this is one of our top questions that we got in the 2022 race. There was a mayoral race on the LA ballot. a lot of people wrote, why is the mayoral race not actually on my ballot? And it turns out a lot of people did not live in the city of LA and therefore wouldn't have had it on their ballot, but they thought they lived in the city of LA. And so so we took that question pretty seriously because it was pretty common. Geography in LA is pretty complicated, actually. And so we featured a story about it, and we sort of explained, just like the simple answer of why you wouldn't be seeing that question or that race on your ballot. Here's a look at our top performing guides for the past 3 elections. And so you'll see that those, what we originally thought of as like the high priority races, district attorney, LA County sheriff, those are still on there. But year to year, LA County Superior Court judges is always our top performing guide. And so a lot of people ask about judges. And you'll also see other races that 0 people talk about, like LA County Assessor, County Central Committees. County Central Committees don't even have any like actual power. They're all volunteer positions and they make endorsements. And so, it was really showcasing that people were just, the experience of a voter was different from what we had originally thought. They were just looking at their ballot, going down the list, trying to find information about a certain race and either finding it or not finding it. And so we were trying to supply information for that experience as much as we possibly could. And so something that we started trying out in 2024 was also trying to get people engaged via the issues they care about. The idea being that, some people, even if they have all the information and they're able to find it, it's very overwhelming. And so maybe they need a couple of different starting points to get them, understanding the ballot through the lens of the issues that they are really passionate about. And so, we produced a series of guides based around some core issues: homelessness, housing affordability, climate change, public safety. And so kind of breaking down, if this is your top issue, these 4 races are the ones that probably have the most direct impact on that issue. Here's how, and here are the questions that tend to divide candidates, where they tend to show their differences the most. And so here are a couple of stats on how, this approach has worked for us. It's been very, very successful ever since we overhauled our strategy. And they really tell us that, we identified a need for information that nobody else in LA was providing, not in this comprehensive kind of way. And this comment is sort of like the whole reason for this, for why we're doing what we're doing, right? This is a comment that we got, I think that's just this past year, where I'm just going to highlight that last line: your site is truly empowering. And that's kind of what this is all for. It's really like, what is the experience of a voter? How should they feel? How do we make them feel good and confident and empowered with their vote, instead of getting lost in the kind of toxicity or, the overwhelm or the cynicism that elections can usually, bring out in like the wider group. Okay. Was there a glitch on the slide? Next.
Sorry. Yeah. Is everything working okay now?
I think so.
Okay. Great.
And so that's sort of like the takeaway for, this whole shift in approach is really like, one way to like help voters make their decisions and think about their experience. So it's really, instead of, what we used to do, which was, journalists just trying to figure out what is important, what is not important, is thinking about it from the perspective of a voter and their experience. What are the questions that they have? What are, if they're not dialed into the news, a lot of people just dial out for 2 years, and then maybe they'll come back and they'll just be like, what is all the stuff I have to make decisions on all of a sudden? Trying to fill that white space is something good to think about. And, again, what makes voters feel confident or empowered about the choice that they're making? And then I'll pass it on to Ariel to talk about many of the other things that we also had to consider when we were making this shift in our approach.
Thanks, Brian. Sorry, everybody, about the slide glitches. I have lost my Zoom window, so I can't see anyone's faces now. So if anybody's having any issues, just unmute and let me know. But while Bree was helping us really think through how the content in the voter guide needed to change, a lot of what I spent my time thinking about is how are people going to experience the voter guide? It's not enough just to think about how the content is serving people's information needs, but making sure that they're able to move through the guide easily and find the information that they are there to get. So the first thing to really think about is, how are people going to navigate the guide, and making sure that in many newsrooms, the person who is designing the guide is often not in the same department as the reporters or editors who are working on the guide content. So making sure that you have somebody liaising with your product team or liaising with your outside vendor who knows the content of the voter guides, because that is really what should drive how the information is organized on your voter guide. The other thing to think about as well, many of us spend a lot of time thinking about our voter guide landing page. That is the thing that ends up, you have endless meetings about, you're trying to decide what should come first, second, or third. But an important thing to think about is not just defaulting to sending people back to the landing page every time they finish a guide. At LAist, a lot of our voter guide traffic comes in through a specific guide. As Brianna noted, a lot of the voter behaviors are seeing something on their ballot, such as LA County Assessor, typing that into the search bar and finding the guide to the LA County Assessor. And so we realized that very on at LAist and had to think a lot about how to help people move through the guide more easily. Early on, our default was to send people back to the landing page, but then people were sort of lost in a page of 20-something links. And so we thought instead, how do we just help them keep going from race to race instead of bringing them back to the election guide all the time? And you can see an example of how we did that in the 2024 primary on the right side of the screen. What you see there is a navigation box that appeared about halfway down most of our voter guides and prioritized the races, sort of brought the most attention to the races that we were getting the most questions about, not necessarily, as Bree already said, the sort of hottest races. I think people can get really wrapped up in navigation and think that they need special search boxes or carousels or all kinds of sort of like fancy innovations to help people move through the content. But what we really learned at LAist is that it doesn't need to be fancy. It just needs to be really, really clear about what you have on offer for people. So you can see here, this is just a straight up info box with some hyperlinks to other parts of the guide. But what we spend a lot of time thinking about is what should the labels be? What is the key information that we want to extract from the guides to help people know why that race matters and why they should click through? And when we started thinking about not driving people to the landing page, but instead helping them move from guide to guide to guide, we found that recirculation or pages per session really went up, not just the time on one single one single guide page, as Bree noted. A third takeaway is the value of having an always-on feedback loop. We spend a lot of time sort of designing surveys and doing really intentional research to figure out what our voter guides need to do for us. But one of the things that we learned at LAist is the value of just having that always-on feedback loop. If you are set up to listen to people, local voters will tell you what they need without you having to work too hard to find out that information. You can always also look back at past elections and look at what the data says. As Bree noted, the early changes we made in 2022 were informed by things that she had seen in 2018 and 2020 in terms of audience questions, voter guide traffic, and things like that. So when in doubt, take a step back and sort of do an informal retro on what you did in past elections and what audience behavior told you about sort of where you hit the mark and where you missed it. The other thing to remember is that you can make changes to your voter guide after publication. When you have one of these always-on feedback loops, for us at LAist, it looks like this question box that you see on the screen. We use Harken, but you could do it with any number of audience listening tools if Harken isn't something that your newsroom uses. As soon as we launched the 2022 general election voter guide, we started immediately getting questions about the California State Court of Appeals. We hadn't done a guide to that race because we left most of the sort of statewide races to our partner Cal Matters, who does an excellent job on that, but they hadn't covered the California State Court of Appeals guide and they weren't planning to. And so one of our reporters, Caitlin Hernandez, ended up doing a really excellent guide. They really hustled on it and got it up a few days, maybe like a week after the voter guide went out, and it immediately soared to one of our most popular voter guides. Again, because we sort of had that always on feedback loop, voters were able to reach out to us and say, hey, what about this one? I can't find a guide to this. I don't know how to make this decision. And so we were able to add that to the voter guide after the fact and really saw that show up in terms of audience behavior. That was one of our most popular guides. This can also help you inform sort of UX. So some of the things that we would see is that people would be reaching out to us asking for things that we had covered, that we had guides to. And so it helped us understand how we could improve the navigation of the site. What were people having a hard time finding? Did we maybe label it poorly? Did we put it in a strange section of the website? Did we need to move it higher up in the navigation box, higher up on the landing page? So those sort of boxes can inform not just what you commission, but also how you organize the information in your voter guide. And you can get started with this today. Put up a feedback box, add it to all of your politics stories. You will be surprised at how much information you probably have to make decisions within the next couple of weeks. Last major takeaway is to understand your election funnel. It's really, really important, especially once your guide is live, but if you can look back at past voter guides, if you've done that in the past, to understand the referral sources for your voter guides. For us at LAist, this might not be true for everybody, but for us, most of our voter guide users were coming in via search, and they were coming in through a guide to a specific race, not the voter guide landing page. So we had to really understand that the beginning of most people's experience with our voter guide was going to be, say, the LA County Assessor Guide or the California State Court of Appeals Guide. So we had to think about, how does that influence the membership box on the guide? How does that influence the newsletter box on the guide? How does that influence how we communicate the value proposition of our voter guide on these specific pages? It wasn't enough to do a really good job of that on the election landing page. Another thing to think about, probably most people here have at least a regular daily or weekly newsletter for their publication. You might be considering making an election-specific sort of pop-up newsletter. When you think about the funnel, it's really important to ask yourself and try to figure out, sort of from past data, are you hoping that that newsletter is going to drive people to your guide? Or because of the prevalence of search, is the guide going to be the thing that people see first before they end up signing up for your newsletter? And how should that inform your newsletter content? How should that inform your newsletter onboarding? At LAist in 2022, we made an election newsletter course called The Ballot is Long that explained the 5 most complicated items on your ballot. The content was great. It was really well written, but the signups for it weren't as high as we hoped. And in particular, very few people that were new to LAist had signed up for it. And in retrospect, it was pretty obvious why. It was redundant with the voter guide. And so if people were first experiencing our election content with the voter guide, there was no reason for them to sign up for a newsletter that was repetitive with the voter guide. A key thing to ask yourself as well is probably many of you will get a huge swell of first-time users to your voter guide, folks that don't engage with you the rest of the year. So how can you move even a slice of people in that sort of that new user subset from unknown to known? How can you get an email address from them or a phone number for them? Or how can you get them to fill out a survey about their experience with the voter guide? And a couple sort of rapid fire things. Today is focused on election guides, but I know newsrooms are thinking through a couple of other questions that I can potentially help you with. A lot of folks are thinking about, should they have an election newsletter? Key thing to think about is, yes, it should help voters, but a good election product also helps you make progress on a goal. Is it to move people from unknown to known? Is it to drive donations? Is it to develop loyalty with some of those folks who are coming to you for the guide? Figuring out what is your organization's goal can help you answer that question of whether it's worth the effort of launching an election newsletter and what it should do for you. And as I mentioned already, consider how it could be complementary to your guide, not repetitive. Should I have an election zine? This is a question that is coming up more and more often. We've done this at LAist. I can talk more about this in the chat or in a call after the fact, but we did a zine for the first time in 2024, rounding up the key details from the issue-based guides that Brie mentioned. What we found, low conversion to our guides via QR codes, but it helped us spark conversations with tabling, and so it added a lot of value there. Question that LAist is asking now is, what are zines best for, and how do we make a zine that maximizes that? Another thing to be thinking about now is, what's your post-election plan? There's a lot of audience attention when the polls close. They want to know how things turn out, but increasingly it can be days or weeks before people know the results. So what's your plan for that sort of in-between moment? How are you going to help people shift from needing information about the specific city council seat, for example, where they are voting, to understanding how the new makeup of the city council will influence policy in the city? I can help with a lot of those questions that we just talked through, and voter guide design and things like that. I'm doing a bit of work with the Night Election Hub specifically to help newsrooms with their election strategies. My email address is on screen. I'll drop it in the chat as well. But I'm happy to help folks think through this. Email me and we'll set up a time to chat. And I'll also make a plug for my colleague, Erica Peterson, who's also working with the Night Election Hub and working specifically on GovPack. So if you are a newsroom that is on WordPress, whether or not you're using Newspack, there is a free tool called GovPack that can help you make customizable, versatile, very easy to build voter guides. And Erica is super happy to take a call with anybody who's interested in learning more about that. Again, we'll drop these links in the chat, but you can see there on the screen the information that you need. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ariel and Brianna. It was really interesting to learn, especially about how the really obscure, unknown races were the ones that took off. So thanks so much for sharing that. We're going to pass it over to Lisa, who's going to talk to us more about what they're working on at Baltimore Beat.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for having me on. One of the things I was thinking about as they were talking is how, very different approaches, very different news outlets, total opposite sides of the coasts. But I think that we're both kind of thinking in the same way about like how to be thoughtful and intentional about the work that we're doing. So I'll talk a little bit first about Baltimore and then the Baltimore Beat, just to kind of set the scene for this. Baltimore is a majority Black city. We are most known for our crime. You might know The Wire. That's what everyone talks to me about. So crime is a very loaded thing in Baltimore. It's a very racially loaded thing. And every year, and every few years when election season comes around, everyone's talking about crime. They're also talking about young people in crime. What do we do about the young people? Not like how do we help them, or what, but it's literally like, what do we do about the problem of these young people? And that's just something I've noticed for a while. I've been here in Baltimore reporting for about 20 years. The Baltimore Beat is something that I started after I lost my job at Baltimore City Paper. That was Baltimore's alt weekly. It had been around for about 40 years. It was purchased by the Baltimore Sun. Everyone in Baltimore knew that when the Sun bought the City Paper, it was a catch and kill, and it was only a matter of time that was going to happen. And it happened about 2 years after they hired me. So the Baltimore Beat is just something that exists out of my sheer willpower. So we don't have a lot of the resources even that the LAist folks were talking about. We're a newsroom that are still very much growing. At the time that we put this guide together, we had an arts and culture editor. We had hired a news editor. It didn't work out, so I was writing, and in addition to leading and building and working with freelancers. So I say that to say that this is work that can be scaled up and down. Like I don't want that to discourage folks from thinking that this is not something they can take on. But just kind of wanted to set the scene for how this starts. Also, the Beat is, we have a print product that comes out every other week. We also have an online product. So the way that this came together was about a year or so ago, Baltimore Beat was invited to join a news collaborative with a few other newsrooms in the area. The Baltimore Banner, which is a larger nonprofit that you may have heard of, our local NPR station, radio station that out of Morgan State University, which is an HBCU here, and Maryland Public Television. We were gathered together by the Annie E. Casey Foundation because they really wanted to put money into journalism that was about young people in Baltimore in a positive and helpful way, and solutions journalism-based way. So they had already begun working together. Again, we're very small, so we had not really done as much content as some of the other newsrooms working together had. Like a lot of the Banner had done a lot of partnership with WYPR, which are NPR station, and I saw that they had been consistently doing a lot of youth-related reporting. And so in my brain, I said the Beat can kind of be a hub for youth-related electoral things, because again, I knew that they weren't ever talked to. They were talked about and not to. And I already had this resource of all this great reporting that had already been done. I brought that to the team. They really liked that idea. So when we had the youth voter guide, we had a page that said reporting from our partners, and it listed a lot of that reporting that had already been done. We also came together and decided to do some surveys and talking to some youth. So we did an online survey where we asked youth to kind of weigh in on different things, whether they were going to vote, what they felt like some of the most pressing issues in Baltimore were, what they would ask a candidate if they had the chance to ask a candidate. We also did an online gathering with some young people, and we did an in-person gathering and asked a lot of the same questions, but also did some talking about how they interacted with journalism or didn't interact with journalism in their communities. And none of them sought out the news at all. None of them. They said, maybe my mom will have the news on when I'm getting ready for school. Maybe I'll see some things on Instagram or Twitter if I'm just scrolling. But none of them said they were looking for news. So again, we put all these things together. Another thing that we used was we are partnered with Wide Angle Youth Media, which is an organization that takes young people in Baltimore and teaches them visual arts in a variety of ways. Some of that is graphic design. So once we had collected the survey results and got really great answers from the young people, I went to them and said, I'd really like for you to design this issue of the Beat. I don't know anything about graphic design. I don't even have the language to talk about graphic design, but I did say I really liked a lot of the answers that we got from young people. So I was like, maybe we could do something text-based, but that's all I did. So working together, those young people and the adults that they work with, they came up with, some ideas for what the cover and what the interior could look like. They decided amongst themselves what the final product was going to be, and the cover that we have is what they decided on. One of the things that I think, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is that I think about this as the beginning of our work. I wanted to mention the fact that none of the kids that we talked to really cared much about journalism, because that's information that we already know. Lots of people have done surveys about people interacting with journalism, and we know at all age groups, our industry has a problem connected with audience. But I think that what we've done now is created a good footprint to begin to continue talking to young people, both through the next voter guide that we're going to be doing in the fall, but also throughout the year. Because when we were talking to young people, we would get on the subject, and like one subject could be a whole session, one subject about transportation, about education, about water, about global issues, and what they kind of expected out of local leaders in response to global issues. Those are all things that we could spend hours on. So yes, again, because I'm so small, I don't have a fancy fancy rollout, but that's what I got to say about our youth voter guide. Hope that's helpful.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Lisa. And I think the point about, you can scale this up, you can scale this down is really important. We don't want anyone watching this to feel intimidated or to feel like they're not doing enough in their voter guides. As long as you are centering your communities first, there are so many ways to make those voter guides and make the most out of the resources that you have to make those voter guides. So I really, really appreciated that perspective that you brought. That takes us to a Q&A. If you guys have any questions for Lisa, Ariel, and Brianna while they're here, highly encourage that you ask them questions while you got them. Drop your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll start answering. Them.
And while we wait too, I want to encourage, if Ariel and Brianna have questions for Lisa or vice versa, feel free to comment on each other's presentations or ask questions about how you did certain things.
Lisa, I'd be curious, because I think I mentioned Bree and I, one of the things we were thinking about coming out of the primary is like what makes a zine successful. And I understand there's a print aspect to the youth voter guide and a digital aspect. So like, how did you think about how the information, like what shows up in print? Because there's often much more like space constraints. You can't hyperlink to things. So how do you think about what goes into a print version of a voter guide? Because that was something that I think we were really not necessarily stumped by, but definitely iterating on, because we hadn't quite, figured it out yet.
Well, one of the biggest, you have these big ideas when you make a project, and then the reality comes slamming at you as a deadline is also coming slamming at you. So we sent out, I think I forgot to mention, we also sent out surveys based on what the young people sent us to candidates. They all had very open-ended questions. So I found myself a week before our deadline with literally 100+ page Google document of candidate answers.
I've been there. Bree and I have been there.
We very quickly had to pivot and say, okay, we're only including the answers to the first question, which is, what do you think is the most important thing that you can do for young people in Baltimore? So it was really just like, we are a 20-page paper that comes out every other week. That means it has that is our very rigid deadline. And that is our very rigid kind of like, framework for this. So at one point, I wanted to have all of the different stories from our reporting or from our partners. Like I wanted to have all of WYPR's reporting. The Banner had done some really great reporting on response to youth violence. We ended up not being able to do that. We ended up having to do links and then QR codes, which people use. They told us that they used them. But really, that's like figuring out creative ways to fit things in almost killed me. But I think we ended up working with it well.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Did that help? I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that does. I think it's also just nice to hear that no matter, as you pointed out, we are doing similar things on different coasts, also encountering some of the same challenges of like trying to figure out how to handle candidate responses and things like that.
Jessel Noor of Solutions Journalism Network, he also manages our cooperative. And so he brings a lot of, the work that they're doing here. And one of the things that we thought about doing for the next round that he's seen some other outlets do is like, almost like an idea to give candidates questions, like, how do you feel about this? And then they can kind of rank them from like 1 to 10. And that's just another way of maybe like gouging how they feel about things without having to figure out how to copy, edit, and lay out lots and lots and lots of text, some of which is like, candidates, anybody can run for office. So some of them were very strong and, based in reality, and some of them, the answers were not. So then there was an issue of trying to figure out, do we even run this if it's not true?
Cool. Thank you.
We are getting some great questions. So I'm going to try to ask them out loud in order. Keep throwing your questions in the chat. I love these. We're going to start with Sam Hunt, who said, it's so helpful to hear how y'all have tackled voter guides. I'm curious if you have advice for small, subject specific, in Sam's case, food and agriculture, newsrooms with a national reach. How can we go about creating a helpful voter guide?
I can start. I mean, I think the way that we approach the issue-based voter guides at LAist probably has a lot of parallels to what you're trying to think through. I think there's also a couple of sort of questions you need to ask yourself before you dig into it. So are you trying to help people sort of understand how sort of food and agriculture show up on their ballot? Are you trying to help people with their decisions at the city level, the state level? Are you trying to help people understand their federal decisions in this? So like naming what sort of level of government you're trying to focus on, I think is one thing that can help you immediately eliminate a bunch of things. And then it might help to actually sort of reach out to a handful of newsrooms, maybe in states where this is particularly important, major agricultural states or things like that. Like, what types of questions do those newsrooms get when elections come through? What are they seeing folks using their voter guides paying attention to? And from there, sort of that can help inform the design of the guide. But my mind immediately goes to distribution as well. So do you have republishing sort of guidelines or partnerships with local, regional news outlets to make sure that these guides and get in front of the people who might be trying to make sort of food and agriculture based decisions when it comes to their ballot? But I think my my starting point whenever I'm trying to figure out how to get started with something is like listing out what questions I need to answer and then sort of like moving through those questions one by one, because that can sort of help you go from staring at like a blank piece of paper with everything on the table to like narrowing in on what area makes the most sense for you to focus on. I don't know if Lisa or Bree have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I agree with what Ariel said, like just trying to narrow down the focus also. And I'm also just curious about like what I guess it's like what your audience might be curious about, or what your audience is coming to you for, or what they might want from you in terms of help with voter stuff. Sometimes it's like they might not expect you to come and help with their specific ballot just because like every jurisdiction is going to be so different. But maybe they'll want help just kind of like pinpointing like where does the vote like have the most like consequence, like when it comes to like X types of policies, like maybe like help understanding the bigger picture of some things is like maybe a service you can provide. But it's sort of just like, yeah, following like what your audience is like wondering about, or like where their information gaps are. Also just thinking about like that experience as well.
Awesome. You guys are asking great questions. Next, we have Kate, who works in East Texas. She has a question for Lisa about how did you reach the youth that you surveyed? What advice do you have for reaching young people?
We started at 0 in that, like, I am 42 years old. I know the young people in my house. Some of the other folks in the newsrooms did not, because of how they raised their money, they honestly weren't even really thinking about young people like that, because they just weren't. Like, one of them said very bluntly, kind of like, I don't even understand why we're doing this. So we started at nothing. And so we had to kind of build off of what we had at the moment, which was like the reach of the Beat, online and in the paper, my own reach, and just asking people to share the word. I ended up having, because we've already done a lot of youth work, and like people kind of know kind of my brand of journalism, I have a lot of people that are involved in youth programming, also a lot of teachers that follow me online. So they spread the word that way. I know I had a few teachers say that they had their classes fill out the survey. But we also know that we have a lot more work to do with the money that someone mentioned that we're getting from the American Press Institute. One of the things that we're going to do is kind of set up shop at different places around the city, like skating rinks, other places like that, and figure out other more creative ways to reach out to young people. Also, Ariel, because Ariel and I were on a call last week, I'm stealing an idea from her, which is like figuring out, are there influencers that we can partner with? Are there ad buys that we can do? Because again, we're very small and we're starting out with nothing. This is something that for me, it's a long-term project. This is something that we're gonna keep growing as the Beat grows, as we get better at this work. So I think, again, a lot of everything I'm gonna say is basically like, start with what you can and reach for the things that you can reach, and then kind of go from there.
Thank you, Lisa. I noticed that there's a question in the chat, not in the Q&A, that I missed. This is from Margot Maxwell. She wants to know, how can you get around the argument from your news department that we don't need to replicate efforts the state is already taking on when it comes to voter guides? If you guys have had to deal with that issue.
At LAist, we haven't necessarily had to deal with this because we have so many city and county races to cover that we've been really grateful that we have Cal Matters as a partner who has taken on covering most of the state level races. I'm not sure if that is what you're referring to, Margot. Are you saying like the actual state government covers these races, or are you saying like statewide organizations are sort of statewide? Are you talking about like state government or other statewide news organizations in terms of making that argument? I don't know if there's an easy way for you to answer in the chat.
I allowed you to unmute if you can talk, Margot.
This is more like statewide resources and evergreen how to vote assets. So getting like creative in that way. We're I think, news, especially around election time, they have so many capacity issues. So they're trying to think, how can you reduce my work, right?
Yeah.
So that's sort of what we're running into. Yeah.
I mean, I think I would look at the data. Does the data indicate that there's real value for you to dig into those? At LAist, we found for us specifically lower benefit to covering those statewide races. For us, they were often easier for people to make decisions because people were making a choice between Democrat and Republican, and they often knew how they were going to vote on those types of things. Whereas in LA, often all of the candidates were Democrats, and so it's harder to parse the difference. But I think I would start with a survey. Again, like that always on feedback box can go a really long way towards starting to sort of collect anecdotally what people's biggest pain points are. It also might be an opportunity for you to get your work published throughout the state. So if no news organization in the state is doing that sort of statewide election information, then you might be able to make the case for that, because it could help you expand your footprint across the state. You could get it republished in like local publications throughout the state and things like that. So it's sort of like, what does the audience need? And then what is sort of what are your organizational goals, and how can you map diving into those sort of state races against your organizational goals? And I think that's usually where the sweet spot is. You're more likely to have the impact you're hoping for if you can point to a specific audience need, but it also needs to serve an organizational goal. So like, can you get paid for that republishing work, or can you raise philanthropic dollars against that republishing work, or things like that? That would be some of my sort of starting points for that.
I would also add, oh, sorry, did you want to say anything else? Oh, I was just going to say, I would also add sort of thinking about if there are different ways that your newsroom approaches the information versus how the statewide outlet does, because it's like, we partner with Cal Matters all the time as well, but we approach elections differently. Like, we have a certain kind of format, we have a certain kind of place that we're starting from, and we're speaking to a specific like Southern California, LA audience, whereas Cal Matters, they mention Northern California a lot, and they mention, other jurisdictions. And so we that's sort of like when we tackle a statewide election, we're going to do it through the lens of like how it affects people here directly. And so, so for us, sometimes it makes sense to do things if there's a lot of interest in like how a specific race affects us, and they don't want like more of a bird's eye view. But it's sort of, I would just say like look at what differences there are in the approaches, and whether your approach like adds a significant amount of additional value that makes it worth tackling instead of relying on the other outlet.
Yeah, and I mean more, I'll drop this link in the chat. The argument that the news department often makes is not like, because we are supposed to be covering the whole state and part of Southwest Washington. We do have yeah, but the case that they make is more like the state resources, like this kind of stuff that I just dropped in the chat is like, okay, well, the government is already doing it. So, why should we, when people can find that information elsewhere? It's a very frustrating argument. And I'm just curious if anyone's run into that and have you tackled it?
I think Bree and I are laughing about this because we frequently rant to each other about how crappy the California version of this is, because probably yours looks a lot like California's, where they just paste everything that people send them and pay for into the guide, and it's has no context. It doesn't have fact checking. It doesn't explain what the positions are or how you should be thinking about those jobs. So I feel like if that's the what they're saying is already covered, it's really easy to look at where you could add value. And Bree, I think you were going to add something to that.
Yeah, I would also say if those state government issued resources were, that helpful and accessible, then we wouldn't be getting as many questions as we were about the things that they provide. And so it's like the accessibility makes a really big difference as well. Yeah, we haven't had that argument in our newsroom, but I think it's because everybody, like, first of all, nobody reads those guides, and so they wouldn't like think to look there to begin with. And like secondly, I think the assumption is that like the government is not great at communicating. They have comprehensive information. It's just that it's really hard to know what you're actually looking at when you look at one of the resources.
Amazing. So I actually didn't realize that you guys could unmute. I've just been asking your questions for you. So I'm going to go to Francisco. You can unmute and ask your question if you want, and I'm happy to ask it for you if you're not able to unmute or don't feel like talking right now. But we've got Francisco next.
Hi, sorry.
I'll wait a few seconds. Good.
So yeah, we're trying to figure out a way to display campaign finance information. Like, is there a way to get like the money behind each race?
Do you want me to take this, Lisa, Bree?
Yeah, I think you can take that because you worked with the campaign finance folks for our project.
Yeah, Francisco, I'll put up an example of how we handled this at LAist on the screen. So this that you see here is, for example, one of our city council districts. We use a data visualization tool called Flourish to do all of our data visualizations. It's not the cheapest out there, but it is really, really easy to work with. And so at LAist had decided it was worth the expense. I will say that LAist is still figuring out sort of the best possible way to approach campaign finance. But this is where we've gotten up to this point, is sort of showing what's been raised by the candidate, the outside spending to support and the outside spending to oppose. This was set up with I believe that this was updated every time a new campaign finance filing deadline passed. I believe it was done manually. Bree and I worked with our colleague Brian Frank on this, and so he handled more of the nuts and bolts. But a lot of what I spent my time thinking about is what is the right way to display this information to help people understand it. So we started by this overall chart. And then we went into sort of breaking down where that money was coming to support specific candidates. You see here, who is it from, the candidate and the amount, and then spending against. In this case, there wasn't any spending against. This was a very big deal in one or two of our other city council races. But the things that I was sort of asking myself coming out of the 2024 primary, as we thought about 2024 general election campaign finance, is why do people want to know about this information, and what is the right way to display that information for that reason? Something that Brianna and I've talked a lot about is people are like very certain that money is manipulating how they get political information, but they can't quite figure out how it is. That is like the overarching sort of need. We saw that in a lot of the questions that we got through the Harkin boxes on the voter guide, is like, who's spending money for this? Who's spending money against this? Or why is this on my ballot? Or why does it sound like this is for something, but I'm hearing that it's actually against something? This is a particularly big deal with the propositions. And I think you're at city side, so you also have the joy of dealing with California's propositions this fall. But I think it really comes down to like, what is the audience need around kind of money in politics? And then how can you orient the visualizations of this around that? I don't think that we got there yet at LA. I think this is like a really good start, but there's a lot of room to improve upon this from that perspective of like, how can we make sense of this? Like if in my dream world, I would have a hover over each of these committees to be able to say like, what is this committee about? Or who funds this committee, or things like that, right? That's what people are trying to figure out, is why are they spending money for this candidate, or why are they spending money against this candidate? So how can you orient your campaign finance work around answering that question of what's the motivation for this? It's like even more about the motivation than the amount of money a lot of the time, is people just want to know like, why are they doing this? How are they trying to manipulate me, is sort of that undercurrent that we were trying to solve for with this. And we commissioned a lot of stories out of our campaign finance data. That was probably the biggest value of having this. When you start to visualize data, you start to see things that might not stand out to you when you're looking in a chart. And so we were to show this to reporters, and reporters started noticing this. And then they commissioned stories such as like, why is the police union spending hundreds of thousands of dollars against this candidate? What's the backstory there? So that might be some of the ways that I started about this. And I'd be super happy, Francisco, to talk one-on-one about this a little bit. This is one of the things that the Night Election Hub has a lot of resources around supporting newsrooms too. So you have my email address in the chat, and I'd be happy to chat more off the call.
Okay, yeah, this is really good.
Awesome. We have one more question left. Sorry, we can't get to all of them, but Daphne, do you want to unmute and ask your question? And if not, I'm going to ask it.
Yeah, it looks like Daphne might have had to jump off. So do you want to get Sayaka's question?
Yeah, sure. Sayaka, okay, there we go. She's here. Go ahead and unmute.
Hi, Sayaka from Triad City Beat. Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
This may or may not be relevant because we're talking about voter guides, but I'm wondering if any of you guys are doing elections related events and how those relate to content that you're making for the voter guides. We're trying to come up with like more engaging events where it's not just like a bunch of candidates sitting on a stage and we're asking them questions, but ways to get voters more engaged. So wondering if you're doing anything like that, and then if that then translates into the content that you're producing.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like I said, for the first voter guide, we had two kind of gatherings with young folks. We did one online and one in person. And it felt like one of the things I remember saying is like, when I was trying to kind of talk about why this is important to folks who maybe had never thought about journalism this way, is that it's not something that's just extractive. Like for me, I was taught journalism that's like, you go to the person, you get the information, and you go away. It's a two-way conversation. So those conversations helped in that we were kind of letting them know what journalists do and why, the work that we do matters. But absolutely that informed the quotes and the quotes that we use in the stories, and also the questions that we asked candidates, what the young people told us. And like I said, I think there's so much more that we can do with those in-person events. It's a way to, like, if I had a lot more money, I would have wanted to print out copies of some of the reporting that we linked to and said, like, if we're meeting people out in public and they're asking about housing issues, or they're asking about, the conflict in Gaza, I can say, this is the reporting that I can send you home with and look at it right now. I think there's all types of benefits that come from in-person events around election stuff, because it's just a different feeling of like talking to people face to face.
I'll also add that we've done like voter-centric events, like kind of like reviewing the propositions on your ballot. We call it ballot cram session. And then we've had forums before. Something new that we started doing actually after the primary election this year, because we randomly got an invite from somebody at UCLA to do a workshop with students based on this grant that they had. And so all we had to do was show up and conduct the workshop. But it was for college students. We ended up doing something about how to research your ballot And it was, we just kind of took people through we made like a fake ballot with like 3 races on it, real races that would show up on the general. And then we sort of explained, we had the students lay out all the questions that they had if they were to see this on their ballot for the very first time. And then we kind of addressed them one by one. Where would you find the answer to this question? Where do we as journalists find answers to these questions? And like, let's talk about what doesn't get answered by the available information and like, how to think about that and sort of like work in a group to kind of like talk about it together. And it was a really great conversation that came out of that. And actually it ended up, informing a lot of, our thinking about like, oh, okay, like what are young voters like thinking about some of these issues? What are the things like adding more to like our pile of like questions of like that people are asking. And so it really hit a lot of like our goals at the same time. It was a really great conversation. So that's like one thing it was a pretty low lift without having to, assemble an entire like community event, if that's something that you're interested in. And we're trying to do that more with community colleges this time around.
Wow, y'all, we are at time. That was so rich and so stimulating. So thank you so much to Lisa, Ariel, and to Brianna for spending the time with us to share out what you've done in your communities. I'll let folks know that what you should expect from us coming forward is the link to this webinar to watch it again. We're also going to send you some takeaways. These are kind of like the top line things that all the panelists shared, as well as some links that you can learn from too. If you would like other additional training, if you're looking for something, please feel free to reach out to us and we can point you in the right direction. And if you want to send us your voter guides, if you're proud of what you're doing, we'd love to feature them in Best of Voter Guides as we put those together. And last but not least, I'd like to invite any Report for America core members to stick around. We have about a half an hour if you want to talk through any of these things further. It'll be with the Election SOS team. We'll let the panelists go back to their regularly scheduled days. But we're so excited and so grateful that everyone showed up today, and hope you learned a ton. I know I did. And we'll see you at our next webinar, hopefully. Don't forget to sign up and we'll see you around. Thanks, Lisa, Brianna, and Ariel. There we are. Okay. All the screens are changing. Have a good day, everyone, and we'll stick around for the RFA folks. Bye.